Okay. Hi. Thanks to each of you for joining us today for this panel discussion called Remember to React, Performance Practices, Politics, and the Institution. My name is Joy Harris. I'm very pleased to host this very esteemed panel in what is the third of a series of discussions in a series called Performing or Possessing a Common Logic, which is a project that aims to bring together artists and thinkers across disciplines to consider commonalities in their practice. So this project is supported by the Houston Arts Alliance and was the recipient of a Let Creativity Happen grant. So a few housekeeping items before we start. Chat will be open. Please feel free to post questions. We'll deal with those after. Please mute your mic. We're all Zoom pros at this point. And I am recording, so if you don't want your video shown, then yes, click it off. We'd like to see your faces, but not everyone likes to look at their face on screen. I don't particularly like to, but I have to in this case because I'm going to introduce our panelists. So we're going to start with James Ball. So Jim, you want to raise your hand? He's an assistant professor in the Department of Performance Studies at Texas A&M University, where he's also the director of the Academy for the Visual and Performing Arts. His research includes the politics of performance and the performance of politics, analyzing both the theatrical structures that underwrite public political events and aesthetic performances that intervene in political processes. His book, Theater of State, a Dramaturgy of the United Nations, was published in 2020 by Northwestern University Press, and it investigates global political spectatorship and the theatricality of international institutions. I had someone, I got Courtney in, great. He has additional writing research has been published in TDR, the Drama Review, e-misférica, the Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, and Brecht Yearbook. Dr. Ball has taught courses on arts activism, performance theory, spectatorship, devising, and interactive theater. Before earning his PhD from NYU in 2012, Dr. Ball produced and directed theater in New York City and in Washington, D.C. So thank you for being here. Next up, Melissa Noble. Melissa is the interim managing director of the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center for the Arts at the University of Houston. She's had a professional career as a dancer, choreographer, and movement consultant, working with theater, dance, and opera companies for over 25 years. She is also an interdisciplinary artist who works in diverse mediums and forms and has taught various topics at academic institutions such as the University of Washington, Indiana University, Juniata College, and Rice University. Her work has been seen at Meany Hall of the Performing Arts in Seattle, the Manhattan Movement Arts Center in New York, and at Houston Grand Opera and San Francisco Opera, and a lot of others. She has a BA in art and art history from the University of Northern Iowa and an MFA in interdisciplinary practice and emerging forms from the University of Houston School of Art. So thank you, Melissa, for being here. And last but not least is Jennifer Mabus, who is a dance artist and is the dance program chair at the University of St. Thomas here in Houston. She served on the dance faculties of Texas Christian University, Sam Houston State University, Houston's HSPVA, San Jacinto College, Booker T. Washington HSPVA, and Interlochen. She's very busy. She received a BFA in dance from SMU and an MFA at Sam Houston. She's also a 500-hour certified yoga instructor. Jennifer has performed with a lot of dance companies, and so I can't list them all here, but she's also notably performed as a soloist and a founding member of BattleWorks, which is Robert Battle's company before he took over as the director of Alvin Ailey. She's also commissioned a lot of work for dance companies here in Texas and across the nation. But here in Houston, she has been commissioned to create work at the Miller Outdoor Theater and Zilka Hall at the Hobby Center. She was the Rice University Dance Artist in Residence, a Noble Motion Dance Next Step Emerging Artist, Dance Source Houston Artist in Residence, and she's also a founding member of a really cool group we have in Houston called Transitory Sound and Movement Collective. So thanks to y'all for coming. I'm going to check to see if I need to let anyone else in. I think we're good. So we're going to get started. So the focus of the panel today is that on institutions, politics, and art, and more specifically, performing arts or performance arts or whatever, that's a very contestable term. But by institution, I mean primarily universities or colleges, but this could also be centers like the Cynthia Mitchell Center at U of H that Melissa's part of, and could also be museums. So what I wanted to do before we get to the question, to the panel discussion, is sort of frame our conversation in two ways. These are sort of the things that I was considering when I was organizing this and sort of preparing for our talk. So two topics. First, I want to have us discuss institutions and their precarious relationship with politics. And then second, I want us to consider how performance radically interrogates the very concepts of institutions, politics, and art. And when Melissa and Jennifer and Jen talk, you'll see that their work is their own creative work, and the projects that they're leading all kind of deal with work within these two ideas. So I'm just going to introduce these two topics, and then we'll get on with it. So institutions like colleges and universities are fertile and pivotal ground for political thinking, but the way in which they function in political discourse can be incredibly diverse. So a couple of examples by what I mean in their role in discourse. In some instances, institutions have been the locus of progressive, liberal activist movements. So I'm thinking of the students who sort of overtook Hamilton Hall at Columbia University in 1968 as a form of solidarity with the civil rights movement and a protest against the Vietnam War. And then on the opposite side of that, you have some institutions who are wanting to stay in this realm of pure thought. So they don't really want to touch political issues at all. And I've been reading the vocation lectures that Max Weber gave in Munich in 1917, and he very strongly believes that universities are there to teach students how to think, not what to think. He thought that there was a issue with faculty members wanting disciples, and he wanted universities to steer clear from that kind of power over the students. I think that at their worst, institutions can be really, really influenced by political parties that are in power, right? That can be disastrous. And I think the worst example that I can think of that sits in my philosophical space is we talk a lot about Martin Heidegger, who was a German philosopher. He was a Nazi sympathizer, and when he took over as rector of Freiburg, he basically dismissed the Jewish faculty members. So, I mean, I think that's sort of the institution in politics at its worst. But what I'm really interested in, and I know I've talked to several of the panelists here about, is the idea of conflict of interest. So if you have limited funding for centers and you have corporate funders, like to what degree do they have influence over what's curated, like what the artists can talk about? Can the artists be critical of the funders, like the space that they're working in, all of that? We've seen, I've seen a lot of issues like that rise up. If we think about the Whitney Biennial, had several artists that pulled out of that because they didn't like the business dealings of someone on the board. We've seen stuff like that also at PS1. So I think that's something that's kind of unique to what's going on right now. And I think, again, I think people have some thoughts on this as well. So the title, Remember to React, is a quote from artist Jenny Holzer. And I think it speaks to this sort of like these different roles that the university can play in politics. And that when you say remember to react, it can be read in a lot of different ways. So the phrase itself is very performative and points to a kind of ambiguity that I think is interesting. So remember to react could be a call to action. Remember to react, this thing is happening, you need to like respond immediately. Remember to react can also be that nagging voice in the back of your head that says you have a responsibility to the world, you need to be doing something. But more gently, remember to react can simply be a reminder that we are in a world connected to a lot of other humans, and that we should be responsible for them, and we should be mindful and careful. So right now in my practice in my life, I'm leaning towards the third, more responsive sort of orientation. But that's where that's sort of where the title comes from. How our artists and arts managers, administrators, faculty like Melissa, Jennifer, and Jem, how are they negotiating within this ambiguity and the various positions that institutions can take in the political landscape? So the other thing that I'm interested in and why I wanted to do this panel is that as someone who is involved in art and I see a lot of art, I am not seeing a lot of work that is purely aesthetically driven per se. I'm seeing a lot of stuff that either explicitly or implicitly deals with politics, a lot of it. And so to me, that means that we should be really thinking about how politics and art, how they're talking to one another. Like, how are they impacting one another? How are they nurturing one another? How are they playing off one another? And I don't know that, I read a lot. I don't know that we really know how to talk about that well. So I'll be curious to hear from this panel how they're dealing with that issue. When you add performance into all this, it becomes very exciting because performance art is usually about politics, and it's usually trying to invoke participation from the public. It is questioning what a political act is. And so if you look at performance artists doing political work, and then we look at a lot of political groups that are using performance as a way to get their message across, it can be very confusing, which is which, right? Where does political activism and performance art end and begin? It's a very blurry line. And in fact, Vanessa Voss, who is on the call right now, hi Nessa, she gave a presentation a couple of months ago about that line between that line between performance art and political dialogue in some pieces of litigation that Alex Jones is involved in. Because Alex Jones, the commentator, said that he doesn't have to be responsible for the words that he says on air because he is a performance artist. So if you want to see that YouTube presentation, I will put it in the chat after we're done. So I guess I'm putting a huge burden on these three speakers because I'm asking them to talk about things that are very big and very complicated. But that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to start right now. Poor Melissa is first up. So we're going to proceed with a couple of questions and some responses, and then we'll move to question and answer from the group, if that's good with y'all. All right, Melissa, you're at the Mitchell Center, and you have a wide range of stakeholders, all with different priorities and points of view. So it seems like your program, like how you're deciding what happens and who you're giving grants to, especially if they have political themes, can be kind of tricky. So I wanted to just ask you about how you're dealing with that at the Mitchell Center, and if you have any projects that come to mind that might relate to this sort of tricky position as a center.
All right, thank you, Joy. So I want to give just a little bit of background about the center, just so if you're not familiar with the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center, you have a bit of context. So as Joy mentioned, we're housed on the campus of University of Houston, and we support a variety of programs, including artists in residence, scholarships, fellowships, performances, exhibitions, and scholarly research. So we have a really broad range. And because we're part of an academic institution, as Joy said, we have a variety of stakeholders, including our board, which is consistent of the units from our college. So theater, dance, music, creative writing, art, and I think that's it. So nothing that we do really gets past our board. We decide together about our programming. We submit artists and all the other projects, and our board of directors votes on it. So that is our process. And then I was going to talk a little bit more about mechanics of a specific piece that we did this just recently, a couple of weeks ago, because I thought that might demonstrate some of the things that you were discussing. And again, because our academic institutions, which I'm sure Jen and James can also attest to, is we're kind of like a city within a city. And certainly University of Houston is a large university. And we have a lot of different, you know, things going on, people involved. So political themes on campus can require a lot of communication between a lot of different entities, all of whom have different concerns about what's going on. So for instance, we just went through this very long process to put a piece up that one of our artists in residence, Sean Leonardo, did for his artist in residency. And it was a piece, a phrase put on the side of a building on campus. I'm going to share this image with you so you can see the piece. All right. So as you can see, this is a phrase. And what you can't quite tell from this image is that just to the right where the tree is coming down, there is a label. And on the label is a QR code where people who are physically there can scan with their phone. And that scan, that QR code leads to a Google Doc where you leave your first interaction with law enforcement anonymously. And then those responses are printed out and they are put around the same phrase, which is actually inside the Blaffer Art Museum. So this was a two-phased piece with this external wall and the internal wall. So I'm going to show you the internal wall phrase as well, just so you can see what it looks like inside the museum with a few of those phrases around it. So inherently, this phrase, especially at this point in time, is somewhat political. And the time frame that we were proposing this to put it up was during the time of Derek Chauvin's, the whole court case was happening. Now, we did not plan that. It just seemed to happen at that time. So I want to explain a little bit about the process that we went through. First of all, this piece, as I mentioned, was part of a exhibition at the Blaffer Art Museum, also on campus, and 3 other artists in residence were having their pieces here at the Blaffer Art Museum. And this exterior piece, again, was part of the interior piece, which you're seeing now. And we decided to plan this exterior version of the interior piece, mostly because we started this process in August and we didn't know if people would even be able to go into the museum. And Sean really wanted a way to engage the larger campus community. And so what I want to point out is that while no one has ever questioned or commented the political concept of the phrase inside the museum, as soon as we started talking about putting it on a wall outside that everyone could see, and I guess even though the public can go into a museum because the Blaffer Art Museum is free to anyone, this became a very different story. So we had to go through quite a long, involved process, which was done by myself and the School of Art director, David Politzer. So we had to follow quite a bit of protocols that were set out by the facilities. We had to be approved by the facilities committee, and that was, they have very specific things that we had to bring to them in a very specific way and propose them. So the process of realizing this very simple phrase on the building was like entering a tangled maze. So the initial response to our inquiry was, yeah, all you have to do is, go through the facilities and they will, you'll get it approved. And then of course, there were all these things we had to do. And we started doing them. So we pursued the elements that they required. And then Once we achieved that one, they said, oh no, there's another one, another requirement that you need to do, okay? And this is common, of course, for large institutions, whether they're academic or not. And so we expected some of that. But once it was approved, then a whole nother line of discussion commenced. And that was other entities on campus, including our PR and marketing, and as well as the facilities themselves. They approved it, but then they didn't really look at apparently what the phrase said, and they suddenly became very concerned with vandalism. And also the chief of police on campus, who was very concerned about how the piece would be received by the students and how it would be used by them, as well as possible use by the public, how that would affect his force, as well as the larger police force in Houston, HPD, because they back up our campus police. So there were a lot of concerns, legitimate concerns, and everyone ultimately was supportive. All of these entities that we had meetings with, no one once said, we don't want you to do this. They just wanted to know what was happening. They wanted to talk through the strategies that they were concerned about. And I believe, I mean, what I came away with from this was ultimately, again, this was good news. I feel like UH supplied a commitment to supporting art that asks difficult questions, and even ones that are political. And we got through the maze and we were able to present this piece, which has had, I think, quite an impact on our community, as well as hopefully anyone else who has come onto campus to use the QR code. So that's sort of what I have to offer tonight. I wonder if anyone has any questions or comments.
I can follow up. I have a follow-up question. In fact, so I was very struck by the language that your chief of police used, right? That he was concerned about how the phrase or how the art would be used. I'm curious about this question of using art in this context specifically, if you could elaborate on what he meant there, but then also the broader question, I think, for our panel, which is, you know, to what extent does the sort of institutional setting invite us to think differently about the uses of art and the uses of art as politics?
Yeah, he was concerned that the art piece would be a point of gathering for protest, whether for police or against police. And again, how that would, he was concerned his force would not be able to handle, or it would get out of hand. And again, he was also worried about the optics, I believe. He didn't quite say it in this way, but the optics with HPD. Like, what does this mean? Does this piece mean you're saying against the police? And so what we answered with, or what I encouraged him to do, was present to, he wanted to let everyone know, especially at HPD, what was happening. And I invited him to couch that as saying, we encourage you and invite everyone to engage with this piece of art. Please come and scan the QR code and put in your experience. That is what this is. It is a piece of art to be engaged with, and we want everyone to engage with it, whether a police officer or a civilian or anyone else. So that went over well, and he did come over and scan it and put in his own experience. And I felt like that was what, you know, Sean Leonardo wants to start conversations, and that's what it did. It started this conversation, right? It was good. What was your second question? Sorry.
My second question was really just sort of broadening the frame then from the specific example to use, or just the phrase, thinking about how do we use art, you know, in politics more generally, and then specifically because our context here is thinking about institutions, whether, you know, the institution of a museum being forced to go through this bureaucracy perhaps, or through the variety of committees and gates, this long process that in another situation may not have taken place, whether it invites us to think differently about the uses of art.
Well, certainly, I think some art doesn't happen because perhaps people aren't as stubborn as I am about going through these processes. And I do think it inhibits art from happening. And I do think that is something that's difficult to bring up to my institution because, you know, they have to do what they have to do. And in their mind, that is, you know, what's happened or what needs to happen. I guess it just reaffirms my commitment to continue to try to do those processes and navigate them so that others can see it is possible, it can happen, and not become discouraged. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you. I'm going to ask Jennifer a question. So during COVID, it seems to me that our everyday actions have been sort of unexpectedly perhaps couched in somewhat performative terms. So in some ways, wearing a mask is about public safety, but it's also a sign of solidarity and these gestures of care, which I found like really interesting. So in November of last year, your students performed Return in a campus parking garage, and performing the space in mask was practical. So your students got to perform. But do you think that this move automatically brought a political element to the piece? And as the choreographer, did the current political landscape impact the work?
Unmute myself here. Short answer, yes, I'll elaborate on that. But just as a way of background as to the kind of dance program that I have and what we're moving within our institution is we're a brand new dance program. We're now 2 years old, fully as a BFA BA program. So we are kind of new to the university, and this kind of performance is new to the university. I am within a Catholic liberal arts university where there is like religious instruction and that sort of thing. Also coming with that, there is a great, that kind of Catholic social justice charity mission. So like during this whole time, they've been doing distributing food for food insecurity. They've been raising funds for students that were caught in horrible situations during COVID. I mean, there's this beautiful thing with all of that, but there's also sort of this is a private institution. And how do we work within that? And there's a broad diversity. They give the professors fairly broad leeway with how we teach our courses, what we say, how we say it, how we approach each of our subjects. So it's a wonderful place to teach, but it's a small community. And so I kind of am able to sort of, because I'm dance and I'm nonverbal, I can kind of sneak things in a lot of ways. And we'll talk about that later as far as the political content. But when we made this piece, we were still in the middle of it all. You know, as far as now, I think we're creating in different ways, and a lot of people are opening up to performing outdoors. And I was responding to my students who were increasingly getting kind of depressed with the online thing. They did not want to do another online performance. We had done a few live online things, and they were like, we do not want to do this. And thankfully, because we're a small university, I was able to do this and got permission very easily to do an outdoor performance before a lot of other universities have been able to do some of this kind of work in their dance programs. And so, you know, of course we had to keep the masks on, and the dancers hated it. They hated the mask I bought them. And it was very hard to dance in, and the audience was in cars surrounding us. I borrowed from Jacob Jonas's performance he had done in a parking lot pre-COVID, and had the audience have a soundtrack in their car and lights. They were the lighting for the dancers. So I was sort of inspired by that and thought, well, why not? We have this beautiful parking garage with views of our chapel and everything. And however, I do feel like because of that, because we were all still in the middle of it, myself as the kind of the director and main choreographer, and the two other adjunct faculty, Ben Deloney and Colette Kerwick, who were choreographing as well, and the students, we all were still very much in the throes of this questioning of what's happening to our art form. You know, dance especially, because of its connection to the body and because of its in-person sort of nature is being turned upside down right now still. And so I think just even making a dance work of people performing together at that moment sort of had a political comment too. And so we were kind of being safe with these masks and taking a little bit of a risk in another way, and speaking to that interplay of isolation and the experience of performing, coming together in that way. You know, a lot of my research pre-COVID was in immersive theater and in collaborative work. And COVID has sort of impacted both of those kinds of work in a big way. And kind of didn't realize that this would be used in this performance. You know, a lot of my research about immersive work is that everything becomes a part of the performance, including the space, that the space becomes a performer as well as the movers in the space. And the parking garage definitely gave us that kind of an environment. Not only was it outdoors and beautiful, but it was also urban and dirty, and you could hear the dancers scuffing on the concrete. The lighting was harsh and shadowy, and you know, so it was just kind of this feeling that it created sort of this urban feeling that kind of really spoke to the challenge of making art right now. In a really beautiful way, I felt like. And you know, and then the masks, of course, while I'm interested in that question. Okay, while the masks were a safety choice and definitely kept our dancers safe, they also sort of had a visual impact, I think, as we see and as we've heard about, of kind of silencing this expressive part of the self and the voice. And so it really forced us to think about the movement and what the dancers were saying with their gestures and the physical movement, and use that to carry meaning, which for young performers is a wonderful challenge and a really good challenge. So all of it was really just a response to that, a response to this time, as far as, you know, the body speaks, and the body, especially right now, is so vulnerable in how it's speaking. Let me see, I had some notes here. Towards the beginning of the pandemic, a friend of mine posted this quote from the Praxis Center for Aesthetic Studies, and I think it kind of informed a lot of this feeling that we're feeling right now as artists. Is it's hard not to get distracted by the virus and to keep making work, but we must. There is a deeper purpose to our presence here and now. As artists, we are conduits of light. We are the manifestation of hope. We know this in our hearts, and we do need to hear it spoken, especially in a time when many of us are questioning our value in the world. And especially, I know for young dancers, when I've had guested into other friends' classes and they wanted me to talk about my experience, there's a lot of dancers that are like, oh, do we go into this career right now? Broadway's been shut down for, you know, like it's sort of this value of what we do within this time. And kind of for me, return became a refusal of this time to erase our value as dancers and what we have to say, and our value as artists and what we have to say, and people and human beings and human bodies. We opened the show with a quote from that Theodore Roosevelt quote from the arena. You know, it's not the critic who counts, but the one who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by sweat and blood, and you know, that whole thing. So we kind of opened with this feeling of like, we're in it, we're fighting, you know, and definitely that's something I think that the young people connected to. And you know, I think in this time where so much of what we're doing is being questioned, it's a good thing too. Like a lot of what's happening in our field in dance is a lot of questioning of how things happen, and power structures, and how things have always been done, and maybe that's not okay anymore. And dance is kind of, along with many institutional things, is kind of facing a reckoning right now. And I think a lot of young people are really fighting the good fight to change it, and a lot of us are trying to do that as educators. And so, you know, along with that, we're kind of questioning what's important in performance. A lot of the Western colonial value system of technique, and what makes a good dancer is also being questioned, and especially when you're in a parking garage in sneakers and you can't see because lights are shining in your eyes. And you know, so it what becomes important in performance, and what do we have to say? And this piece was sort of about kind of living those questions, as far as letting us try to answer them and see what happens. You know, I think a lot of it, my approach kind of as teacher and as an educator was to try to help the students find their voices and to find some empowerment and liberation through that. So I included a whole lot of improvisation, and a lot of the students were making choices as to the movement they were saying, and I think that really impacted the meaning. I'll show a little clip that'll kind of show what that is. So let me share the screen. One student, let me see, let's see, advanced video. Here we go. I think I'm doing this right. Forgive me, you guys. So here we go. Can everybody see this? Just let me know if you can't. In the beginning of this clip, you'll see a dancer kind of doing some really violent gestures. She's a dancer. She's had a lot of hip hop, crumping training and things like that. And there was a moment in the piece where I was like, Bianca, go for it. Do what you do. And, you know, she chose a lot of really violent images, and it, you know, with also with the shootings that are going on, with the violence of our time with school shootings, it was like, whoa. And that was not my doing, that was her doing, you know. And so that was something that was really powerful about the piece, I think, is because the young people were speaking for where they are right now. That was a really cool moment to see. It also made me, you know, of course, think about that video that we've seen of protests of the guy crumping in front of the police, and just kind of the power of the body at this time without words. So I'll share a little and I'll stop talking. Again, you can see the mask. This is the dancer that was doing the crumping solo. And a lot of it is, you can see kind of the feeling of the mask. The dancers trying to dance together, but they have to keep some distance. To create duets where we don't touch. The music is by Kirk Sudreth. He's a local musician, and he also was improvising the entire time. So the dancers had to stay really alive and listen. They couldn't predict what the music was going to be. We had some guest professional performers as well. Shouting run. They had to give like physical cues to each other, so they were shouting, but it kind of brought another sense of meaning as well to me, as how many feel right now. There you kind of see how the mask brings people alive. Moments where they had to respond to each other. I don't know if you could hear anything I was saying over the music, but and a lot of just speaking to that closing image, of course, you know, there's that strong like feminist image of the fist in the air, and of that empowering, you know, image we all kind of grew up seeing. But along with that, I used some poetry at the end that they improvised to by Shane Koisen. And the first line of it was, be calm, loosen your grip, opening each palm slowly now, let go. So in the end, there was this sense of letting go of that as well. So it was kind of this sense of where we are and how do we like speak our rage against it, but also how do we let go and move into whatever we're supposed to create now. I'll just kind of close, I guess, my thoughts on all of that with a quote from Robert Battle that I heard at one of the panels during one of these panels I've listened to during this time. And he said, you know, speaking your truth is a revolutionary act. And I feel like by allowing the dancers to speak through this, we were able to kind of allow them to have their voice and speak their frustration and everything that's going on, but to find some empowerment through that. So for me as an educator, that was my most proud moment, not even so much as an art maker, but just as seeing them take ownership and empowering themselves to take ownership in this performance environment. So I think that's it. Let's see.
Great. Melissa, did you want to make any comments or follow-up questions?
Yeah, I do. Jennifer, when was that performed?
It was in November, early November, this last fall.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was really early, as you mentioned. I just didn't know exactly the time frame.
Yeah.
Kudos to you for creating a space and a way for your students to do some performance, because it really, you know, hasn't started happening for most places until now, really, right?
Yeah.
So it's just really amazing that you did that, and I'm sure that it saved everyone's sanity in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I was very grateful being in a small institution.
Yeah. I mean, well, one of my questions was sort of what Joy was talking about early on, which, like, did you get any pushback or feedback from either the audience or the students or your institution about wearing the masks? Like, either everyone wanted to wear them or people didn't want to wear them, or I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the students knew we had to. They hate it, but they're used to it by now. They struggled. They're like, it's just hard to breathe. I'm like, I know, deal. And thankfully we've been able to train in the studio and in masks the entire time. And I think the masks have kept us from having any issues within our students. I don't think we've, knock on wood, had a case yet. We're a small program, so that's easier too. You know, I was more concerned about the audience. Thankfully, they were in their cars. I had to say, if you're getting out of your car, you do have to wear your mask. And, you know, I could see a little just people socializing with each other. And I was like, oh, there's not distance, you know, like, but for the most part, people were pretty cool with it, especially where we were. And, you know, I think a lot of people as audience members kind of know, okay, if I want to see this, this is what we do. And so fortunately, that was pretty easy, and they could stay in their cars if they didn't want to wear the mask. And we were also, you know, I think fortunate that the audience was very generous. You know, I was watching it the first run through that we had going, oh my gosh, you know, they were losing their timing together, and like seeing all the stuff that you see as a dance teacher and the flaws of the performance. And the students themselves, I mean, the audience themselves, like everyone was just like, thank you. Thank you for creating live performance. Thank you for making this happen. And, you know, one woman was like, I was crying. It's the first time I've seen bodies moving in space in a year, you know, or since April or since March last year. And so there was something really beautiful about that and really supportive. And even this spring, we were supposed to have an outdoor performance on our lawn in front of our chapel, and it was just going to be so beautiful. And it rained. So we were back in the parking garage, and there we were again. And again, though, I found the audience to be very, very grateful and very supportive for the opportunity to create. The dancers were, you know, they were kind of complaining at this point because they're like, oh, we're on this hard surface again, blah, 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 you know, but it's, in the end, I think we're just kind of grateful to still be able to be doing it. And I know for me, I'm a dancer first, always. And if I can't do that, I sort of feel like part of me is cut off. And I think that allowing those dancers to have that opportunity was really empowering for all of us. So beyond the art making, I think that was the powerful moment. But thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna pivot to Jim. So Texas A&M's Department of Performance Studies seems to put politics and social justice at the center of its work. Most recently, I'm thinking about the department's Race Talk speaker series and your new undergraduate certificate in performing social activism. And at the Academy for the Visual and Performing Arts, you often program artists doing work on political themes like Tanya El-Khoury and Basil Zara's work as far as isolation goes, which I got to participate in. It was amazing. And The Just and the Blind by Mark Bamuthi, Joseph, Daniel Bernard, Roman and Drew Dawes, which I'm sorry if I butchered those names. So how and why do you encourage political performance in your two roles, so you as a teacher and as an administrator?
Sure, yeah. I had prepared some things I thought I would say at this point, but then after hearing this conversation, I think I've rewritten everything. I'm going off script, so or thinking of it, tossing my notes and using new notes because the conversation's been so fruitful so far and so exciting. And one thing I've been constantly reminded of listening to both Melissa and Jennifer is sort of a way that I'm thinking and paraphrasing the anthropologist Mary Douglas, thinking about institutions, and that institutions classify and they contain as well, right? That institutions, their job is to kind of like put meaning on something that's nebulous, put it in order, right? Whether it's an art institution where you put it on a wall and there we go, it's art, or something like that. But institutions also, again, contain, prevent that thing from maybe getting out and infecting the others. Is another way to think of it. And I think this cuts both ways if we're thinking about how political performance might appear in a college classroom or in what we program, right? That if we're classifying and containing, yes, there's the danger of that kind of like obfuscating or standardizing what otherwise might be really revolutionary or radical practices. But there's also what we saw, I think, with what Jennifer was talking about, the way in which that those practices can create safe spaces of encounter. And if I went into the pandemic year, a year and a half ago, invested in art that provokes, I'm increasingly reminded of the importance of art that is also makes these safe spaces for engagement, right? And thinking as well about the Sean Leonardo performance and the way that the institution itself was what allowed conversations to happen. Like that art piece of art wouldn't be the same if it was graffiti on the wall. Totally different set of engagements than if it's happening in an institutional setting. So then I think about what we do in the Department of Performance Studies, where I teach and do my research, and with the AVPA, the presenting and granting organization that I'm director of. And I think an example of this, or something we're thinking about, is that the certificate that you mentioned on performing social activism. And at the heart of this certificate that we've developed are two new courses. One is called The Aesthetics of Activism, and it's kind of a survey of activist practices throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, with looking at them through the lens of performance and performance studies. If you're not familiar with the discipline of performance studies, we look at performance on an expanded field, right? On a broad spectrum, from things that happen in everyday life through to everything we see on stages, dance, music, theater, and the like. And our faculty here has a very diverse background in that sense as well. We have, I do theater studies, we have ethnomusicologists, composers, etc. So aesthetics of activism is thinking about, how do people, like citizens, people in the streets, do politics, and how is that performance, and what do we say, what do we mean when we say that it's performance? But at the culminating event in that class, and it's designed to be a large class, taught to almost 100 students, big lecture type thing, students are required to do an action. They have to work in a group that is randomly assigned, come up with something that they're committed to as a group, write a little manifesto, design their activist action, and then actually go do it as well. And so I've taught versions of this class years ago at University of Maryland in a different sort of context, and it's being taught right now, and I need to check in with the professors teaching it to find out how these actions are going. But I know from my previous experience that that there's you need to encourage students to get out and challenge themselves, but then there's also space to have those institutional conversations, to recognize that the institution itself becomes a stage or a script or a scenario, right? A set of constraints and affordances that we play off of and with in order to accomplish a political end. right? That it's yeah, if we think about the architecture becoming the duetting partner in an immersive dance piece or site-specific dance piece, you know, with the institution is always our duetting partner when we're making art in these spaces. You know, so finding that balance between provocation and then safety on the other hand. With the AVPA, my work's been a little bit different because there, you know, we have yet to bring artists doing work as provocative, I think, as Sean Leonardo's was, though we did have, you know, the two pieces that we were able to bring this spring on political themes. As far as isolation goes, which Joy mentioned, you know, connected. It was a one-on-one performance via Zoom, and it connected audience members here, well, anywhere really, but mostly here in Texas, via Zoom with a musician and street artist living in the UK right now, but who's a Palestinian refugee who had been living in Syria, lived all his life in refugee camps in Syria, but fled when the Syrian civil war came about. So you know, connecting people here with one life experience with a very different life experience, an experience of migration specifically, which has all of these resonances for us in Texas, certainly in the United States more broadly. After that, the second piece you mentioned, The Just and the Blind, that was perhaps more similar to what Jennifer was describing. That was a collaboration between a spoken word artist, a street dancer, and a composer and musician, and none of them could be in the same room. So each of them, so we were bringing them all together in a virtual space. I can share an image here. This is actually from their talkback, but there's a particular reason I want to share this image as opposed to the one of them performing. So the image here, right, we brought them into this space of live stream and then live streamed it out to our audiences. But then we had that space for audiences to respond. And I wasn't planning this when I got this screen capture earlier today, but I think that the audience question that's being posed here speaks precisely to the importance of like of safety and being able to access, you know, to balance our provocations with those kind of moments of care for our audiences and for our students and so on, right? The presumably a student here asked, how do you create a balance between the topics you deal with? And the piece, I'm sorry, I should say, is about police violence against people of color, about the relationship between Black fathers and their sons, you know, all of those. So content-wise, in a similar territory to Sean Leonardo's piece, but certainly in form and style, less controversial, I think. Because again, it could possibly be seen to be contained, right? If we put it here in art, we don't have to deal with it in the street. So I suppose I don't have an end to that part of the comment. The last thing I would say, thinking about institutions and performances, is thinking, well, about my own research. So as you mentioned, you know, I do the bulk of my research is actually on diplomacy, on the UN, the United Nations as an institution, and thinking about that as a space for performance. And there again, that's where like a lot of these ideas of institution as stage, script, or scenario come through, right? An institution is a framework. There's all of us, I think, have this experience of, you know, we all try to tug the institution in one direction or another, and it's the sort of the sum of all our movements that kind of inch the behemoth in one way or another. But all that tugging is perhaps what we need to pay attention to. Like that's the place where politics and the political is happening when we're making art in these institutions. I think I'll stop there and take other questions. I just was excited. All this conversation got me riffing.
I have a question for you. So if institutions are the place where discourse is sort of formulated, like the language, the concepts, the structure, like, so institutions create, they institutionalize vocabulary, they institutionalize particular forms of discourse, right? I'm curious, like when you have art, because we've talked about technique, right? We're talking about art as political action. versus, and the vocabulary to discuss that versus the vocabulary that's been developed to talk about art as an aesthetic form, like the words how we talk about paintings, how we talk about sculpture, all these things. There's a craft to it. There's a way we discuss what you did well, what you didn't do well, you do crits, all these sorts of things. There's a discourse on that, right? And so what happens is that discourse kind of goes out the window to some extent when you are dealing with political content, because you're also concerned with like the content, the political content of it in a way that's different than if you're making an object, right? So I guess, do we have a rich enough institutionalized art vocabulary to really talk about political art yet? I feel like it's emerging, because what I see is that you can have someone who has this great idea for a political action, but as people trained in performance, like all of y'all, right? You're like, that's a great idea, but you could have done it like this and it would have been a little bit more effective, right? But then that kind of takes away, like, no, what I'm trying to get across is this. And so the technique doesn't matter, right? So and the institutions where y'all work are the places where discourse is being developed and put out into the world. How do you think you can, or should you, or might you be reformulating how we talk about practice, right? Where it is about technique, because art does have technique, but it's not just about technique, but it's about concept and not just about concept. Like, how do we keep the separation between the content and the art practice? How do we look at them separately and then look at them combined so we can create political works that become like there's some trajectory to them? I don't know if I made that very clear.
I have answers. I'm not sure they're gonna help, like that they're the ones you're looking for, or that. So I mean, I think you begin right by saying that we have this language to talk about aesthetics, right, and to talk about technique and to talk about all these other things. But increasingly, we use that same language to talk about politics.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's a blending there that's already being prejudged. I'm kind of not sure that we should maintain like content and form as separate. And I think that there's also a history of that in both art criticism and in art making, right? That the language that we use to talk about technique is, you know, pointing to all of these things, all of the elements that go into the creation of the art also speak to the politics of that art very often. So I'll bring it back to that aesthetics of activism course. We use we have two textbooks in the course. One is Beautiful Trouble, which is it's here, a toolbox for the revolution. It's does, you know, breaks down activism via case studies, but also breaks down into principles, tactics, strategies, things you can use, and so on. And many of them are artful and technique oriented, and many of them as well, though, are really about the content and kind of about how you conceive of an action, things like that. The other textbook that we're using is Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy, which I've heard more artists sort of invoking, especially in the performing arts, as a source for their thinking about doing their work in the last, I'd say in the last 3 years. I hear it coming up in conversations in a lot of unexpected places. But she comes from an activist background, and it's a book about organizing and so on, but it's also a book about like micropolitics, right? About how we infuse that sort of our political commitments into our organizing and our everyday things. So to me, the sort of the language for talking about the political content of art can never be divorced from the language that we use to talk about technique, or the language that we use to talk about the form itself, right? Because inherent in our forms and inherent in our techniques are politics, right? This is the question of like decolonizing our practices, or producing an anti-racist or an anti-imperial practice. And it's not, so if the question that you posed was about how do we come up with the lexicon, I think we don't want to come up with the lexicon, but we want to always be committed to doing the work.
Right, but so I'm going to push back on this a little bit. So my question is that if I'm looking at someone who creates a work about a specific issue, right? And so like, or let's pretend that I'm one of you and I see a student who's doing work and it has to deal with a specific issue. And I know that the content that they're using, their interpretation of content sort of manifesto they're making around the content isn't well articulated, doesn't make sense, isn't founded in something that's rigorous, right? It's just how they feel. And so for performance art especially, we don't have to do anything. We can just feel everywhere and it's fine, right? So like, so that's what I'm talking about the vocabulary, because there has to be a way to say this action is great for these reasons. It needs development in these areas, but the content that you're developing is strong in this way, but it's not coherent. And since you're doing political work, the coherency of that argument is incredibly important. And so to me, in my experience talking to people who are dealing with in practice, is that rigor for the content is not as important as the rigor around the work of art, right? And so that's the thing that is curious to me, because I think it's great for everyone to go and do creative action, but I want them to be really clear about what they're saying and why they're saying it. Because if we're going to be forces for change, we should be articulate forces for change sometimes. And I worry about the muddling of the critique within that space, because it is so close. I agree with you, it's very close. Maybe that makes me a difficult person, or asking too much, right?
But I also hear you, I feel like you answer your question in the question itself, right? What you've just said, right, is the answer. That's the language that you would approach that student with. And you know, there is in, you know, those who study activism, whether it thinks of itself as art activism or not, right? There is language for, you know, assessing the efficacy, right? And assessing, you know, whether it's expressive or instrumental, what expresses, how clear it expresses it. I mean, I would also make space for that student to have a really great and clear articulation of why the action itself didn't need to be clear, right? Or why the content needed to be muddied, right? So.
Yeah. I overtook that. And there's a question in the chat that I should, unless somebody else wanted to say something. Melissa, were you trying to talk? Did I cut you off?
I did want to say something about the technique. I mean, I think that at least what I see in a lot of the courses that I've taken as an artist in academia specifically is that many of the people teaching those courses are only focused on the technique, and that they actually I have even had this said to me, I don't care what it's about, I want to make sure you can do it properly. So, I mean, there's the argument, right, of certain levels of education, which is, this is an argument anyway that I've heard people use in academia, which is you can't, you know, first you have to learn the technique, then you can go away from it, right? But when you're talking about more interdisciplinary, which is, you know, the combining and I agree more with Jim about we should be teaching it all together. And I think part of the problem, or maybe part of what the lack is that we don't have technicians teaching technique who have that language, experience, education. And not that they should necessarily if they're teaching ballet technique, you know, but then how do we create an education that is more cohesive? And so is it that they are paired with somebody? Is that, you know, I mean, I'm just like throwing stuff out there now, but do we require that for our ballet teachers so that they can address pieces that students want to do that are political? Because students seem to want to do that. They are, I have noticed anyway. I don't know if Jen, even the dance students that I know and the theater students are doing it.
Leonardo, are you still here? Do you want to ask the question, or I can read the question from the chat. There's not that many of us if you want to speak. Okay, I will read the question then. It says, how do you think your institution's history and demographics has framed your horizon of possibilities when it comes to scheduling edgy and politically progressive performances? Any unspoken or explicit hints to stay away from certain artists or topics do you feel your institution has your back? And I think that was written, oh, you know, just don't drive in, talk in, FaceTime, and Zoom at the same time. Perfect. I think that question was related to what you were talking about, Jennifer.
Yes, yes. And short answer is actually yes, they do have my back in a lot of ways. But when I was hired to do this, I kind of asked, do I need to, like, create work around sacred themes, or, bring in a local Christian dance company and create partnerships? What do we need to do around that? Or is that an important thing? And I was kind of given the directive to make good dance, or, to do good dance. Granted, there may be some subtle things along with that, that I have not approached yet. I'm still learning my way around through that institution. But as far as it goes, I feel like they're getting all of the theology, philosophy, instruction. I can actually stay within my wheelhouse and teach dance and choreography and dance making and all of that. But kind of going back to the safe space of engagement, James, I love that way you called that. With dance, I have a little more leeway, and I know, Joy, we had talked about this earlier.
Yeah.
To wander into some subjects because maybe it's not framed by words. This past semester, I had a student do her capstone, and she wanted to talk about a relationship that she had been through, and kind of about what that process is like of letting go of someone and that kind of thing. And she hired 2 male dancers to do it. And even though she herself, it was not a gay relationship, but she just, those were the dancers that were available, and they were beautiful. And we were able to hire 2 professional dancers locally. And I was like, am I going to get pushback? I don't know. Let's do it. And I don't want to censor student work. And so I was like, I'll be willing to stand by it as a good work. And I worked with her on making sure the statement she wanted to say was clear, and that we didn't get caught up in some things like that. And no one said a thing. So granted, these dancers were so beautiful and so good that they were kind of young local professionals that were in town and needed work. And so that's where dance, I think, kind of is an interesting crossover in this. Like, I think of companies like, Alvin Ailey, who, it was revolutionary in its starting, the first African-American dance company, the first, and they do these works that speak to police violence and the Black experience in America and all of that, thinking of Don McHale's work about being in a chain gang and all this stuff. And they do these works, but they sell out to opera houses around the world, high dollar tickets, and everyone, usually leaves talking about the dancers and how beautiful they are. And, it's kind of this like beautiful subversive thing that they do as far as like content versus technique. And, then again, there are people that could argue that they are still within sort of colonial structures, just put that into another culture. There's a lot of arguments around that. But that discussion of craft, technique versus content, and we kind of see that in dance a lot, and I do think young people are wanting to say something, and that's something, even as an educator, like, so much of us were having to look at that. Like, okay, I teach ballet, but I have a student in my class that's trans, or I have a student like, do I need to do the same old uniform that we always do, pink tights and leotard, like, or can we kind of create some leeway in that in our training? And, how do I allow the students' voices to speak into my class when my background is in Western modern dance techniques, Graham, Taylor, Lamone, how do we find that conversation, and how do we really examine what we teach and why we teach it, and how do we can keep the value? Like, I can't go teach something that is not I can't co-opt another technique and teach something like that, but like, how do I still, do I bring in guest artists? Do I bring, how do I still allow that other voice in, and how do I examine where I'm coming from as far as coming from, white privileged background? How do I question that, answer that? How do I bring the students into that conversation? So I don't know the answers yet either, but I was glad that you brought that up, Melissa. I thought that was really great.
Does anyone else have any questions? I think I've gotten everything out of the chat. I owe Camelia a thing right here, but I can't type and think at the same time. I'm not good like that. Oh, hi, do you have a question you want to ask?
No, I just wanted to say it got after you recapped and pushed back, I understood what the question was.
Oh,
Like,
okay, yes, it was a very long wind up for that question. So I didn't have the privilege of getting organized in my head before I started talking. So thank you. Okay, we're definitely used up our time here. I'm more than happy to keep going, but we've been about an hour, so I will let our panelists. I guess if any of you want to give last words or tidy anything up, and then we can we'll depart ways. Anybody have any closing words? No. Oh, thank you, Millie. Yes. Well, I thank you all for coming. There's a Thursday nights are not always the easiest nights to get away, at least for me. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Melissa and Jennifer and Jim. I learned a lot. So selfishly, I think this was great. And I think the work that each of you do is so inspiring, and so lucky to know you all and to be involved in your dialogue and what you're trying to accomplish. So I feel very grateful for that. So I guess I will say good night, and I hope to see you guys soon. We have another one of these with Leslie Ahrens and Julia Barbosa-Landois on May the 4th, which is Tuesday at 5 o'clock. It's called Pathways to Wonder, and it is about environmentalism and activism through the reading of Rachel Carson. And so Leslie Ahrens is a public philosopher dealing with environmental ethics, and Julia Barbosa-Landois is the artist here in Houston. She does like a variety. She works within a variety of medium, but she also is engaged in performance. So it should be really cool. So Tuesday at 5 o'clock, and you can find information on my website or on Facebook. So thank you. I'll see y'all soon. Bye.
Can you post the website? I want to see some of the other discussions too.
Oh, yes. I'll do it right here. I don't have all the, I should actually plug also, it's in the news section. We're going to have a performance on May the 15th in Montrose in my house, in my backyard. And it'll be dealing with queering philosophy and drag performance. It's going to be awesome. So if you're interested in that, I'm gonna put some stuff on my website about that. But that's Rivka, friend here in Houston, and then Matthew Pontibe is working on his PhD in philosophy at University of North Texas. So should be cool. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you guys. Thank you, Melissa.
Bye.
That was awesome.
Well, that was tons of fun. Yeah.